we may not consider ourselves religious, but we're all spiritual. You don't hear many people say, I'm not spiritual. And the word, spiritus really means breath, the breath of our being. So to say I'm not spiritual is a bit like saying I don't do much breathing. There is this aspect to us which is more than our intellect or our emotions or a sort of song rising in our hearts, if you like. When I was a small boy, I remember my grandfather who'd founded this school, a school I was attending. So you're talking the late 1950s. And I remember so well my grandfather who had retired as headmaster. And my father was now running the school. But Grandpa came in and led morning prayers. I would have been 6 at the time, I think. And he talked about Psalm 23. And he told a beautiful story which remained in my mind about a small shepherd boy. And he made the whole psalm come alive. And it was obvious that, my grandfather thought this was the most important piece of the Bible. He thought that this was precious wisdom. And he was choosing to talk about this to a classroom of very young schoolboys. But it remained with me that Psalm 23 was really important. And of course, it is pretty well the most quoted part of the Bible. You'll see Psalm 23 often in funeral services or in state occasions. And sometimes it's in wedding services too. And it's widely used throughout the Christian church all over the world. And it's a 3,000-year-old song, arguably the most beautiful song in the world. That was the phrase that was sort of coming around in my mind, circulating in my thoughts about 10 years ago. The most beautiful song in the world. The music's long forgotten. We know that the writer of Psalm 23 was a shepherd, David. We know that he became king. We know all the great stories about him, and even people who don't know the Bible at all well would probably have heard of Goliath. It's the sort of story that children are told at primary school, although maybe not so much these days, and maybe not at all in so many places. But here was this boy who had heroically killed a giant and saved his people. And here was a boy who grew up to write and sing wonderful songs. And his music was enchanting. We know that from the stories in the Bible. And so King David played the harp and he sang. And Psalm 23 is very short. I mean, it's not much more than 100 words. But it captures everything, really, of the whole movement of life itself. And it starts with wonderful images of being led into green pastures. The love and care of God, the restoration of the human soul. And then it goes into the valley of the shadow of death, which is one of the most famous phrases in all literature. And that still is used proverbially about somebody going through the valley of the shadow of death. Whether it's literally through somebody dying, or whether it's the end of a marriage, the collapse of a business, some terrible thing that's happened. Wartime, the valley of the shadow of death. It's full of these great phrases which have remained with us, but then it talks about coming through that valley with hope and help and even a banquet of love and being followed by goodness and mercy throughout our whole lives. So it's so positive. And I kept thinking about this psalm over many years, reading it, of course, going back to it. And I think it would be about 10 years ago, I started to think maybe I could, I'm a playwright. I'm not somebody who writes spiritual books in inverted commas. I'm not a commentator on the Bible or anything, but maybe I could write a little book about Psalm 23 evoking my own feelings and perhaps a little bit of my own story around it. And so I started to do this, and I just wrote different chapters. I decided to write a chapter on each verse. So the first chapter is "The Lord is my shepherd," and then the next chapter is "I shall not want," and the next chapter is "He makes me to lie down in green pastures," and so on throughout the psalm. There's about 15 chapters or so. And it took me a while to write it. It's a very short and easy book to read. It's only about 20,000 words or so, and you could read the book in 2 hours. You can read Psalm 23 in 2 minutes, but I'm just unpacking it. I'm taking people on a journey, and I found myself at times being quite autobiographical, mentioning stories that had happened to me, things that had been difficult in my life, exciting things. I talk quite a bit about Freswick Castle and the sea here and the wild elemental world here, and I bring in various aspects of my own life journey into the book. And yes, the first sort of idea I had was to call it the most beautiful song in the world. But actually, talking with my publishers, we decided to give it a different title, which was Anthem for Life, which I think really worked out really well for us. This idea of, those of us who love football, think about anthems, for football teams. In my case, I support Liverpool, and so "You'll Never Walk Alone" is really the anthem for football, Liverpool Football Club. But Anthem for Life, here's a poem, here's an unbelievably memorable piece of writing that's very lyrical and very profound, very simple, and yet very deep. Anthem for life. This is something you could sing through your whole life. And so in the book, I encourage people to learn the psalm and recite it every day. It's something I do. And I really take people through, many of whom I think who've read the book are not Christians, or not necessarily interested at all in religion. But, one of the things I say early on in the book is that, we may not consider ourselves religious, but we're all spiritual. You don't hear many people say, "I'm not spiritual." And the word, spiritus really means breath, the breath of our being. So to say I'm not spiritual is a bit like saying I don't do much breathing. Everybody breathes physically and everybody is spiritual, whether they're religious or whether they ascribe to any particular religion or not. There is this aspect to us which is more than our intellect or our emotions or, more than, if you like, the kind of bare facts of our existence. There's something else that often awakened by great art or by beauty in nature or by the birth of a child, but a sort of song rising in our hearts, if you like, a sort of natural worship, not in a kind of ritualistic or kind of devotional religious way, but a natural outpouring of thanks, of glory, of praise, of hope, which is what happens when I've had 2 sons, and those are the emotions around the birth of babies. But over many things we do in fact worship. We're spiritual beings. And so I wanted to appeal to people irrespective of their beliefs. And it's an Old Testament, from the Hebrew scriptures. So it's not talking about Jesus Christ. It's not talking about the New Testament or the Christian religion. It's talking about something in common, that Christians, Muslims and Jewish people all can have in common, is Psalm 23. And I believe it's there for people, even those who are right beyond the margins of faith. I think there's a lot to be gained just to go into it as one of the great expressions of the human spirit. So I wanted to write a book that would work for very deeply committed Christians, but would also work for someone who didn't know what they believed, or even somebody who didn't believe in God at all. I wanted to write a book that would be like a portal, like a window into the spiritual world. And that's it. Beautifully presented by the publishers, actually, and a very small book you can have in your pocket, and lovely title pages on each of the verses, and in bold certain passages in my writing which just stand out. So it's incredibly easy to read, and I don't mean that in a naive way or lazy way. Easy to read in that you can just read a few pages, like a very short chapter before going to sleep or something, or on a train or whatever. And I've had amazing letters from people around the world saying how they've come back and back and back to this and read it over and over again. So I couldn't be more delighted, really, with the response to Anthem for Life.